Hello everybody and welcome to the 2024 Tecmo All-Season Rewind here on SVGN, the Sports Video Game Network. I am your host, Joe. We have had quite a wild season here in SVGN going throughout the Tecmo season. It's been a very busy one, and I would love to continue on and show you just how things have gone for everybody. But before we do that, I want to give a couple of shout-outs right at the start, just that way we can give some people their proper due. The first one we're going to give a shout-out to is Mr. the Shadowon here on YouTube. You might have heard his voice during each of our games of the week. He is the one that welcomes you here before I speak. Right after that, I also want to give a shout-out to S. Blue Man, who, if you don't like how this Tecmo season has gone, he's provided you a way of playing through the Tecmo NFL season via your NES emulator, whatever that way might be. You might have seen the link to his Twitter and his website here in the description of our Games of the Week, as well as during our full Tecmo Rewinds. He does great work, and it's thanks to him. This is not sponsored, by the way. But it's thanks to him that we are able to present you with the Tecmo NFL season as we do. And the other two shoutouts I want to give are to two of the members of our YouTube community who have done amazing work as fans. They have been really providing us with a lot of positive feedback, and that is Good03 Boy, who has commented on pretty much every single one of our videos, including our shorts that we recently uploaded with the Tecmo recaps, as well as Andy C6996. If you go onto any Game of the Week video, you might see his comment down there. He provides full-on stat breakdowns of every single player and the on offense and all of the defensive big moments in his comments. So, real big shout out to the both of you. We here at SVGN recognize your comments. You guys do great, and we are glad that you have been on board with us. And that goes for the rest of you, whether you've been here back when we started this last season, or you're just tuning in today. We want to thank you for being here to support us with your attention and with your support. Now, with that said, let's get around to some of this actual Tecmo Rewind for the season. We'll start with how the divisions look overall. Of course, we always start in the AFC with the East, where this year it was the New York Jets that ran away with it, though it did get a little bit dicey later on in the season. It actually took until about week 17 before the Jets fully clinched the AFC East, and even then, the Patriots were starting to nip at their heels. Their season has been a bit up and down, as has the Bills. A lot of people really surprised by the Bills just not doing all that well this season. And down at the bottom, unfortunately, the Miami Dolphins. On to the AFC North, probably the best division this season in the Tecmo NFL season. The Bengals getting to 15 wins, the Ravens and Browns taking up the two AFC wildcard spots, and even though they didn't make the playoffs, the Steelers getting to an 8-8 record. That is impressive. They are the only division where all four teams managed to go 500 or better. Moving on to the AFC South, where the Colts come away victorious at a 10-6 record. Following right behind them, the Jacksonville Jaguars. It was real close. I'm sure some fans down in Florida are disappointed, but the Colts winning the division for the first time since 2014, when they had Andrew Luck as their quarterback in his third year. And then there's the AFC West. You got the Kansas City Chiefs, who basically just ran away with this one as soon as they could. Started out a little slow, but managed to get a hold of the division lead, and then once they got it, they did not let go. The Chargers, rather disappointing season from them, and then the poor Raiders and Broncos were just absolutely devastated throughout this season. So, unfortunate for them, but fortunate for the Chiefs, who are on their quest to three-peat. Moving onward to the NFC, we go to the East, where the Eagles and Cowboys tied for the same record, but the Eagles had the tiebreaker, so they get the division. This division has not had a repeat division winner in about 20 years, and that tradition continues this year. And unfortunately for both the Giants and Commanders, they dwell in the basement, not just of their division, but for the entire Tecmo NFL season itself. These two teams going to have the top 2 draft picks when it comes to the 2025 draft. Onward to the NFC North. Vikings aside, this division did pretty well for itself. All 3 teams that managed to get into the playoffs got in with 10 wins, whereas the Vikings, unfortunately, going to be picking 3rd in the draft this season. You have to wonder what would have happened if the Vikings hadn't lost J.J. McCarthy in the offseason. Would they have done better, or would they be struggling? Moving on to the NFC South, where it's a very big surprise, but the Atlanta Falcons have won this division. First time that they have done that since the 2016 NFL season, where they had head coach Dan Quinn and quarterback Matt Ryan. Things should be very interesting for Atlanta going into the playoffs. The Saints, unfortunately, missing out on the playoffs. And down at the bottom, you have the Panthers and the Buccaneers, who did not do all that well. And moving on to the NFC West, where it was all San Francisco the entire way, leading this division basically from the moment that this season started. Followed behind them are the Rams, Seahawks, and Cardinals, who, fun fact, if this season had expanded playoffs, you would have the Rams as the 9 seed, the Seahawks as the 10, and the Cardinals as the 11. But all 3 of these teams just were not able to overcome Brock Purdy and Kyle Shanahan. Now, with that out of the way, we're going to take a look at some of the awards that we are handing out this season. First things first, we'll start with the Offensive Player of the Year. This award going to go to Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. He had 255 rushing attempts for 2,260 yards. That's an average of 8.8 yards per attempt, and 38 touchdowns. He also caught 7 catches for 95 yards, with an average of 13.5 yards per catch. Moving onward, the Defensive Player of the Year is going to go to Myles Garrett of the Cleveland Browns, who had himself 31 sacks this season, as well as quite a few fumble recoveries. Moving on, the Offensive Rookie of the Year. I don't think anyone is going to be surprised by this one. It's Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. He was 209 for 331 on the season, throwing 63 touchdowns and only 7 interceptions. He threw for 5,796 yards. That's an average of 7.5 yards per attempt. That's an average of 17.5 yards per attempt, and a completion percentage of 63.1%. That gives him a QB rating of 107.7. He also had 27 runs for 360 yards. That's an average of 13.3 yards per carry, and 4 touchdowns, as he led his Chicago Bears to a playoff berth. And meanwhile, looking to the Defensive Rookie of the Year, that is going to go to Laiatu Latu of the Indianapolis Colts. Latu had 8 sacks for Indianapolis this year, leading all rookies, as well as a couple of fumble recoveries of his own. And for the Comeback Player of the Year, I think it's a pretty easy choice. That would be Aaron Rodgers, coming off of an injury of the 2023 Tecmo NFL season. Near the end, he managed to help will the New York Jets to a major playoff berth this season, winning the NFC East for the first time in well over 20 years. Moving onward, the Coach of the Year is going to be Robert Saleh of the New York Jets. Saleh leading the Jets to an 11-5 record, far better than what they've had in previous seasons, and leading the Jets to their first division title for the NFC East since 2002, which was in between the Patriots' first 2 Super Bowl seasons. Fun fact there. And the Assistant Coach of the Year award is is going to go to Dan Pitcher of the Cincinnati Bengals. Pitcher managed to help coach this offense into being the best offense in the NFL at 8,008 total yards on offense. That's 5,978 on passing, 2,030 on rushing, and giving them 755 total points, giving them an average of 47.19 points per game. And of course, we have to talk about the MVP of this season, and I don't think anyone is going to be surprised of who the MVP is. That's right, it's Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. Burrow completed 193 out of 342 passes this season for 63 touchdowns, only throwing 5 interceptions. He had 5,978 yards on those passes. That's an average of 17.4 yards per attempt, with a completion percentage of 56.4. That puts his QB rating at 103.2. He also ran 10 times with the ball for 105 yards. That's 10.5 yards per carry, and actually scored a rushing touchdown, as he led the Cincinnati Bengals to a 15-1 record. Moving on, we're going to look at the leaders of each individual stat category that we have on record here. We'll start, obviously, with our quarterbacks with QB rating. Caleb Williams actually leading the league at QB rating at 107.7. Followed behind him are Jared Goff at 104.5, Lamar Jackson at 103.8, MVP Joe Burrow at 103.2, and Trevor Lawrence at 101 even. Moving on to completion percentage, the leader of this season, Lamar Jackson with a 68.6 percentage. Followed behind him are Josh Allen at 64.7, Jared Goff at 63.8, Caleb Williams at 63.1, and Trevor Lawrence at 59.8. For passing attempts, Dak Prescott of Dallas Cowboys has the most passes this season at 391. Right behind him are Gardner Minshew of the Raiders at 389, Bo Nix of the Broncos at 376, Russell Wilson at 376 as well, and Kyler Murray at 374. For passing completions, that also is being led by Dak Prescott, who had 222 completions on the season. Behind him are CJ Stroud, Caleb Williams, Patrick Mahomes, and a tie between Trevor Lawrence and Lamar Jackson. For passing yards, Dak Prescott leads that as well at 6,038 yards altogether. The only QB to throw for 6,000 yards this season. Behind him are Joe Burrow, CJ Stroud, Trevor Lawrence, and Caleb Williams. Caleb does, however, lead the passing yards per attempt category at 17.5. Followed right behind him are Joe Burrow, Geno Smith, Trevor Lawrence, and Jared Goff. For touchdown passes, it's a three-way tie, actually, between Caleb Williams, Dak Prescott, and Joe Burrow at 63 each. Followed behind them are Trevor Lawrence at 58, and a tie between Jared Goff and CJ Stroud at 55. Interception percentage for the season, however, goes to Joe Burrow at 1.4 altogether. Followed behind him are CJ Stroud, Caleb Williams, Jared Goff, and Jacoby Brissett. Moving on, we're going to go to the receiving categories with receptions, being led by Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings at 84. Right behind him, it's a three-way tie between Malik Nabers, Calvin Ridley, and Keon Coleman at 80 each, and CeeDee Lamb at 79 altogether this season. But CeeDee does have the most receiving yards this season at 3,107. Just behind him is Justin Jefferson at 2,825, followed by George Pickens at 2,726, Stephon Diggs at 2,617, and Brian Thomas Jr. at 2,528. For receiving yards per catch, Devonta Smith leads the league at 46.3 yards per catch, followed right behind him Jalen Waddle, then Garrett Wilson, George Pickens, and Tyreek Hill. So that's two Dolphins in the top 5 for that category. Onward to touchdown catches, where it's a tie between CeeDee Lamb and rookie Brian Thomas Jr. at 31 apiece. While behind them are George Pickens at 30, and the tie between Bengals players T. Higgins and Jamar Chase at 26 each. Next up are the leaders in rushing categories, and we start with rushing yards, where Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts leads the league at 2,370. Followed behind him, Josh Jacobs, the Offensive Player of the Year, Christian McCaffrey, Ramondre Stevenson, and Zach Moss. In terms of rushing attempts, Josh Jacobs and Ramondre Stevenson lead at 255 apiece, followed by J.K. Dobbins, Kenneth Walker III, and Chuba Hubbard. Rushing yards per attempt is actually not going to go to a running back, but a quarterback, as Lamar Jackson leads the league at 12.3, followed by two more quarterbacks with Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. Takes to fourth place before we get to a running back, and that's tied with another quarterback. His Bijan Robinson of the Falcons is tied with Anthony Richardson of the Colts. Moving on, rushing touchdowns altogether, Josh Jacobs leads the league with that at 38. Followed behind him, Jonathan Taylor with 37, so right behind them both. Then Christian McCaffrey, Zach Moss, and Isaiah Pacheco. For those wondering, Lamar Jackson is the 10th ranked quarterback with 20. Onward, we have points scored, where Jonathan Taylor leads the league in that regard with 240 points to his name. Followed behind him, Josh Jacobs at 228, Christian McCaffrey at 192, CeeDee Lamb at 186, and George Pickens at 180. In terms of total touchdowns, Jonathan Taylor leads that as expected, followed by all the other players that we mentioned before, which is part of the reason why they lead with the total touchdowns. Jonathan Taylor having 40, followed by Josh Jacobs with 38, Christian McCaffrey 32, and then CeeDee Lamb and Brian Thomas Jr. at 31 each. In terms of extra points kicked, this is the kicking records now. Justin Tucker leads the league in that regard with 96. Followed right behind him, Evan McPherson with 95, Kairos Santos with 94, and then Jake Moody and Braden Arveson at 92 apiece. For field goals, the leader in that regard is Will Lutz of the Denver Broncos with 35 field goals made this season. While behind him are Younghoe Koo at 29, Joshua Carty at 28, and both Blake Ruby and Daniel Carlson at 27 apiece. Now on to punting. Yes, we're going to give some recognition to the punters this season. Ryan Stonehouse leads the league in average yards per punt at 61.9. Followed behind him, Corey Bajorquez of the Browns at 60.8, Brian Anger with 60.4, Braden Mann at 60.2, and Mitch Wishnowsky at 60 even. In terms of number of punts, Johnny Hecker leads the league with 41, followed by Jake Camarda of the Buccaneers, Matthew Hayball, Bryce Behringer, and Jake Bailey. Onward to the defensive stats. We're starting with interceptions. Justin Simmons and Denzel Ward leading the league with 11 interceptions apiece. And behind them both, Donovan Wilson, CJ Gardner-Johnson, and Jalen Elliott with 9 each. In terms of total interception yards, though, Justin Simmons leading that category at 189. Followed behind him, Tyrann Mathieu, Christian Benford, Minkah Fitzpatrick, and Antoine Winfield Jr. And in terms of pick sixes, only 14 players recorded a pick six this season, but Minkah Fitzpatrick and Tony Adams both have 2 apiece. And in terms of the other players, you have Budda Baker, Charvarius Ward, Justin Simmons, Antoine Winfield Jr., Marcus Epps, Trent McDuffie, Marcus Williams, Marlon Humphrey, Grant Delpit, Juan Thornhill, Jabril Peppers, and Javon Holland. For sacks, Myles Garrett, the Defensive Player of the Year, leading the league with 31 sacks to his name. Right behind him, Cameron Hayward with 25. Then Derek Brown and Terrell Bernard at 23 each. And then a three-way tie for 5th place with Aiden Hutchinson, Nakobe Dean, and Logan Wilson at 20 apiece. Finally, we go to special teams. We'll start with punt returns. In terms of yards per punt return, Rashid Shaheed of the Saints leads the league at 19.4, while behind him Avery Williams of the Falcons at 14.8. Then 2 players on the same team, Devin Duvernay and Tank Bigsby. And then right behind them both is a tie for 5th place with 13.5 between Kyron Williams and Britton Covey. In terms of punt return yards, Calvin Austin III actually leads the entire league at 459, followed by Avery Williams, Keyshawn Nixon, Rashid Shaheed, and Darius Davis. Calvin Austin III has so many punt return yards because he has the most punt returns, having 37 punt returns this season, followed by Keyshawn Nixon, Jaquan Jackson, Darius Davis, and Jacob Cowing. And finally, we have kick returning, where Keyshawn Nixon leads the league with 20.6 yards per kick return. Followed behind him are Avery Williams, Blake Corum, Jamal Williams, and Rashid Shaheed. So that's 2 Saints players to round out the top 5. For kick return yards, Raheem Blackshear actually has the most yards at 2,047. While behind him are Keyshawn Nixon, Cavante Turpin, Darius Davis, and Isaiah Rogers. And just like with punt returns, Raheem Blackshear also leading the league in kick returns with 113. Following right behind him are Cavante Turpin, Isaiah Rogers, and Braxton Berrios tied at 98. And tied for 5th place with 95 are Keyshawn Nixon and Gunnar Olszewski. Moving on to the overall team stats, we take a look at the total offense of these teams. The Cincinnati Bengals, as you can see, leading overall with 8,008 yards, which is what allowed their offensive coordinator to be awarded the Assistant Coach of the Year, followed by Baltimore, San Francisco, Philly, and Detroit to round out the top 5. And here's a look at all of the teams that are currently in the playoffs and how their total offense looks. Meanwhile, we go on to passing offense, where it's actually the Cowboys who are first overall at 6,038 yards, followed by the Bengals, Bears, Texans, and Jaguars. And again, here is a look at the total passing offense for each of the playoff teams, as well as their current rankings. Onward to the rushing offenses, where it's the Colts who lead at 3,325, followed by Baltimore, Philly, San Francisco, and New England. And once more, a look at all of the playoff teams when it comes to their rushing offenses. Meanwhile, onward to the defense, where the Falcons currently lead the total defensive rankings with only allowing 5,904 yards, followed by New Orleans, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and the Chargers. And here are the playoff teams. In terms of passing defense, number 1 overall goes to the Saints at 4,376, followed by the Rams, Steelers, Falcons, and Bills. And here are the playoff teams' total passing defenses and rankings. Moving on, rushing yards for defense. The Ravens have the best rushing defense in the league with 1,295 yards allowed on the ground. Follow that up with Atlanta, New Orleans, Philadelphia, and the Chargers. And once more, the total defense of the teams in the playoffs with their rankings. Meanwhile, in terms of offense, in terms of scoring, the Bengals currently have the lead with that at 755 points altogether this season, followed up by Baltimore, Chicago, San Francisco, and Green Bay. And of course, here's the look at the rankings for the teams in the playoffs. And finally, we go to the points allowed, where the Steelers have the best defense in terms of allowing the least number of points at 449, followed by Atlanta, Cincinnati, San Francisco, and Baltimore. And of course, the rankings for the playoff teams. And before we go, we've got one last thing to look at, and that is the Pro Bowl. We're going to announce who the rosters are for each of the Pro Bowl teams, as well as the reserves in case those players cannot make it for being at the Super Bowl. We'll start with the AFC roster, where the quarterback room has Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, and CJ Stroud. Now, if either Joe Burrow or Lamar Jackson cannot make it because of being in the Tecmo Super Bowl, that will mean that Trevor Lawrence will be the reserve, following up behind them. Onward to the running backs with Jonathan Taylor, Breece Hall, Zach Moss, and Derrick Henry, and the reserve is Ramondre Stevenson. For wide receivers, George Pickens, Brian Thomas Jr., T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase. Now, if the Bengals make it to the Tecmo Super Bowl and both cannot make it to the Pro Bowl, that means that not only will DeAndre Hopkins be added, but so will Stephon Diggs of the Texans. Moving onward, the tight ends will be Jonnu Smith and Mark Andrews, with the reserve being Travis Kelce. On the offensive line, for the offensive tackles, you have Trent Brown, Laramie Tunsil, and Jack Conklin. For the guards, Elijah Vera-Tucker, Peter Skoronski, and Creed Humphrey. And for centers, David Andrews, Mitch Morse, and Daniel Falele. Now moving onward to defensive ends, you'll have Myles Garrett, Cameron Hayward, and Ed Oliver. Grover Stewart and Tershawn Wharton are the nose tackles. For linebackers, Kyle Van Noy, TJ Watt, and Khalil Mack are the outside linebackers, while the inside linebackers are Terrell Bernard, Logan Wilson, and Denzel Perryman. At the corners, Denzel Ward, Juju Brents, Jalen Ramsey, and Trent McDuffie. Nick Cross, Jalen Elliott, and Kyle Hamilton are the safeties. For the long snapper, it's Ethan Pocic out of Cleveland. Ryan Stonehouse is the punter for the AFC Pro Bowl team. Evan McPherson, the place kicker for the AFC. At the return specialist position, it's Darius Davis. And for special teamers, Marcus Jones. Moving onward now to the NFC. For the quarterbacks, it's Dak Prescott, Caleb Williams, and Jared Goff. Josh Jacobs, Christian McCaffrey, Kenneth Walker III, and Chuba Hubbard will be the running backs. At the wide receiver positions, you got CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Malik Nabers, and Devonta Smith. Kyle Pitts and Trey McBride are the tight ends. On the offensive line, your tackles will be Darnell Wright, Penei Sewell, and Trevor Penning. At the guard positions, Steve Avila, Damian Lewis, and Zach Martin. And for the centers, Jake Brendel, Dejounte Froholt, and Drew Dahlman. For the NFC's defensive ends, Derek Brown, Aiden Hutchinson, and Justin Jones. At nose tackle, David Onyemata and Dexter Lawrence. For the outside linebackers, Matthew John, Cameron Jordan, and Byron Young. While Nakobe Dean, Tremaine Edmonds, and Levante David are the inside linebackers. For the corners, Trayvon Diggs, Devin Witherspoon, Tariq Woolen, and Charvarius Ward. The safeties for the NFC are Justin Simmons, Donovan Wilson, and C.J. Gardner-Johnson. Cam Jurgens from Philadelphia will be the long snapper, and he'll be long snapping to Brian Anger on punts from Dallas. And if he needs to long snap to the kicker, that will be Younghoe Koo. Rashid Shaheed will be the return specialist for the NFC. And meanwhile, the special teamer will be Keyshawn Nixon. And that is going to do it for us today. A reminder to you all that tomorrow we'll be starting the playoffs with the Ravens taking on the Jets. Then on Saturday, we will have the Bears playing against the Eagles. On Sunday, the Colts will be playing host to the Browns. And to come back on Monday for the battle between the Lions and Falcons. For all of us here at SVGN, the Sports Video Game Network, I'm your host, Joe, saying good night, everybody!